Kim, welcome to the Grin Gets Real podcast. I'm so excited to have you on here to just kind of share your knowledge of emails that we send out. And actually, more than emails, it's more about the communication and representing your brand. So, super excited to have you on as a guest today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So, let's start it off with having you kind of introduce yourself and what your area of expertise is before we dive into it.
So I'm known by some of my clients as the email whisperer for my sins. So I've spent the last 20 years 25 years now in communication, and really have sort of honed a bit of a niche in the world of email. And this is around helping us communicate more effectively remotely. And it's really gone up organizations' priority lists, particularly with hybrid working now. Yeah. We're seeing lots more emails being sent out. It's harder to get people's attention. Email's having to do so much more than it ever did. So we're using it to, build relationships from afar, contact people cold out of the blue, get invoices paid, move projects forward, just get the darn thing done. And we're also seeing that email is now becoming very much a representation of our brand. So we're being judged much more on our emails because that's what people see from us far more than they see our faces or they ever see us in person. So our emails are a representation of our organizational brand, our employer brand, if we're hiring people, and certainly our personal brand as well. So my work with organizations is really to help them make sure that their brand is properly represented through their written communications with a real focus on email. So we do consulting, we do training, and we have a license program called Email Engagement.
I love that. And I am really excited at the fact that we're going to focus more on the communication side and not just the marketing side. So we're not going to be chatting today about just kind of the post-purchase survey. Like, what should that email sequence look like? We are really going to get down to just like the nuts and bolts of like what goes into those emails. How can we stand out in an email box? Because to your point, we are getting a ton more emails. And as a brand, it's really tough to stand out in that email box. But even harder if I want to communicate something very simple from like a business side, right? So tell me what you're seeing consistently that people, like the quote unquote mistakes people are making when they're putting together those communication emails.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? A lot of time we focus so much on marketing email. So it's like, if we're sending out via a platform, then it gets all our love and attention, and it might go through like 5 layers of sign off and people looking at it and what's the subject line and A/B testing and all of this, kind of stuff. And we're applying all these sort of marketing principles to it. Have we got a call to action? Have we, we getting attention? Have we got the right headline? All this kind of stuff. But at the same time, we and our teams are sending out hundreds of emails every single day. And every single one of those emails drip feeds our brand and our story into the hands of our stakeholders, our clients, our colleagues, our customers. And so there's this real big disconnect. So one of the biggest things that I see to your question is this neglect of these everyday communications. That we're not applying all of these things that we really do know how to do, and most organizations can do, but it's siloed. Or it might just be that the sales team, are applying this to very specific sales emails that they send out. But there's no consistency across the board, and there's no knowledge sharing or best practice. There's no consideration really as well for how that relates to the organizational brand. You might find that you have certain people who are really great at email writing, but they do it in their own style, their own way. So it's a bit like the Wild West out there at the moment. It's pretty scrappy, Few organizations have any kind of playbook for business emails. There's no, they might have a brand tone of voice, but there's nothing,
Yeah.
they don't apply that to these everyday communications. So it's scrappy. It's scrappy and really out of whack with the amount of emails that we're sending. So on average, we're spending around a third of our work week on email, and we'll spend 6 years of our lives on email. It's like, oh my God.
I know when you break it down to time like that, you're like, yeah, that's a lot of time to not be thinking of how you're saying it and what you're saying. One of the things that you just said is that um, most brands don't have a business email like playbook when it comes to it. And I know you're right. Like most people do focus on those marketing sequences. That's like how are we going to represent our brand if we're putting together all of that love, like you mentioned, on those sequences, but I don't have a standard way to communicate when I get a one-off email from a customer who says, or who has a question, or maybe I have a question for them. And I think initially my knee jerk is, do we want to have a playbook for that? Because you want to infuse your authentic personality in it. So what's that balance between let me be me, but also represent the brand? So how do we walk that line?
So really great question. And I think one of the things that we do wrong with email is that we are too stiff and too
Mhm.
formal and too corporate.
Yeah.
It's like I would say to you, hey Katya, how you doing? And on an email, I hope this email finds you well. We
Are you reading my emails?
And there's this just massive disconnect between who we might be in person, warm, friendly. And I hear this all the time from clients. They say, oh, I'm really great in person. I'm really engaging. I have great conversations with clients. But when I get on email, it all starts to go wrong and they don't reply to me. And often this
Yeah.
is because of tone of voice. We get very stiff and formal, and often we can think, oh, I need to be professional.
Yeah.
Or we go completely the other way. And this is a problem now with with some Gen Z who are coming through, who are very used to messaging platforms,
Yeah.
but perhaps it's too informal for some brands, not all brands, but for some.
Yeah.
So there is that delicate balance where you need to establish some expectations around, this is how we approach email. These are the things that we teach in email engagement is, how to write like you speak, how to be concise. What's the ideal length of an email,
Mm,
length of a sentence? How do you start your email? How do you end it? So there's a framework for your email, but enough of that room for personality, because ultimately that matters so much more than email etiquette. I hate the phrase email etiquette. It drives me crazy. It's like, something from the 1900s, and we're not in top hats and wearing crinolines anymore. This is we are far more informal. So personality really is what engages people. We can forgive, I always think of one client of mine whose voice just shouts out of the page every time she writes. And it's normally a sort of jumble of words scattered with emojis, but it makes me smile every single time because I can hear her and she's a wonderful person. And I get that in every single email.
yeah.
And it's got lots of exclamation marks and it's, quite crazy and out there, but boy, does it engage. So we need to sort of make that balance between, coming across as engaging, full of personality, but also making it easy for our recipient to read and digest what we're saying.
Okay. So I'm gonna definitely dive into that because the first point that you made was really infusing your personality into it, like, or writing how you speak. And I kind of combine those two things, right? Writing how you speak is really tough because if you don't know me, how do you know what my tone is and how do you represent that in an email? And I think that's really difficult. And maybe this is from a person who doesn't use the emojis, but I can see how, like, the emojis, you can hear her. How do we get to people to hear our voice? How do we write like we speak and be articulate and sound intelligent? Or maybe I'm trying to do too many things with one email. Now that I say this out loud, but you know what I mean? I think, well, and this is not, and when we really talk about communication, it's email, but it's also Slack as well too. Like, I've definitely been accused of maybe not using enough emojis. So I come off a little more curt than I really am, right? But when I'm writing things, it's to the point where I'm at. Like, I'm a bullet point person. I appreciate the bullet points on my receiving end. I don't have enough time to like read these long emails. So I'm writing my emails from that perspective, not from my personality. So, like, what's some advice that you can give for writing how you speak?
It is a really difficult one, and I mean, we could talk all day about emojis. They're really
that's on its own language.
Yeah, it's they're super divisive. Some people love them, some people hate them, and you can really turn people off. But you can go the other way and come across as, I'm a bit formal. You can come across as quite, curt, abrupt, a bit rude, formal, like you're being really directive with people. So some tips for writing like you speak. I think a really great tool is the read aloud function. And I use it for every single email I send.
Nice.
And hearing your words spoken aloud by someone else is a really powerful tool. There's an app called Speechify as well, which is fantastic, which has more kind of natural sounding voices. The ones embedded on a lot of email programs are a bit robotic.
You're like, I definitely don't sound like that.
Exactly. Whereas Speechify, I think you can choose like Gwyneth Paltrow if you want to read it.
Oh, very nice.
So I think that's a really great way of just hearing what you're saying from someone else's perspective. So you will hear where your sentences are too long, for example, and they're starting to get a bit stodgy. You'll hear where, words like utilize, things that we wouldn't use in speech. It really is asking yourself, would I say this to my 15-year-old? Would I say this to my mum? Would I say this to, the delivery driver? And that is more the kind of language that we should be using. So it's not about dumbing down. People often get the two mixed up.
Yeah.
It's about, simplifying for simplifying's sake. But this is about making things easy. So there's been lots and lots of studies done which prove that people think we are more intelligent when we use simpler language. And it's exactly the, opposite to what we think. So, if you think about when you go and visit a doctor, and if they, and you've got a sore thumb, and you go to the doctor and they say, oh, well, there's a problem with your ventricular hypoxia, doodah, and you might be sitting there going, oh my God, what's going on? And if they say, oh, look, don't worry, this is an inflammation, it'll go down in the next few days. It's reassuring. So I always think about that sort of doctor scenario. We want people to be able to act on our emails quickly. And the way to do that is to make them feel good, to make them feel reassured. So reading stuff aloud, swapping out those stodgy, I call them, I don't know if it is an American word as well. Would you ever use the word stodgy?
No, but you know what? From this day forward, I will be using the word stodgy.
It's how we would describe.
It's all encompassing, I feel like.
Yeah, it's how we would describe like a really heavy sort of dessert, like the sort of one that's kind of, like a pie or a pudding that's just, sits in the bottom of your stomach and you can kind of stand your spoon up in. That's how we describe stodgy. And you get that feeling with emails when you open them up and you're like, oh my God, this makes me feel tired just before I've even read it.
Yes.
So using this sort of lighter language, really checking yourself and saying, would I say the word utilize? Would I say to my kids, utilize your cutlery, children, utilize your silverware? We would
Yeah.
say cutlery. I wouldn't. I'd be like, use your fork. And
Yeah.
that's how we'd approach it. I wouldn't say to my husband, please ensure that you've locked the door. I'd say, oh, can you make sure you've locked the door? Just that little change from ensure to make sure just
Yeah.
eases everything up. Using contractions. So it's instead of it is, we're instead of we are. These tiny little tweaks make your email easier to read. And everything that we do should be making it easy for our reader, not necessarily easier for us as the writer.
This is very true. And sometimes it can be stifling to try to be so formal because it's not the natural way that you would ask
Mm.
someone, to your point, right? Like I've seen people obsess over an email and I'm
Yes.
like, that's like a sentence. That's not like even a whole email. Just send it out. Or maybe there's a better way to just kind of communicate that. So those are some really great tips. Remove the stodgy language. You see that? I'm already using it. I like that. Contractions as well too. Love that. Emojis probably sparingly, and if that makes sense for your personality, I think that definitely works. Now let's dive into the length of something, right? And
Mm.
I'm sure that it varies because if it's quick communication, it's not going to be as long. But if I'm trying to explain something and break something down so that they save for later, that's what I'm thinking of. The save for later emails. Like, do you send those out as well too? Or is it more of quick communication? Or do you view business emails that cover the entire spectrum of quick communication, save for later, and somewhere in between?
Well, I tend to think that the save for later emails tend to go to one place, and that's the email graveyard where they they go to die. Um, I mean, generally, you want someone to open that email and think, this is something that I can read and do quickly.
Okay.
Email is not the best tool, I would say, for lots of longer communication. So it can be a super useful audit tool, but if you're sending tons and tons and tons of stuff, you probably need to rethink how you're doing it. On average, we need to be thinking about 80 words email, 80 words or less in an email. So
Oh,
that's
interesting.
5 or 6 sentences.
That is not a lot of sentences. And now I'm rethinking lots of choices in my life and every email I've sent out. Well, I think in this remote working environment, we tend to want to put everything in the kitchen sink in there. So I think more now than ever am I getting those save for later, which sometimes is really nice because that's where all the links are, because there's so many different places where
Yes.
things are living nowadays.
Yes.
So that's why I wonder, but also if it's a save for now, I want it to look visually appealing so it's
There you
easy
go.
for me to go through. So what are your thoughts on that? I once read this book about formatting your emails.
Mm.
So like the bolding and like be very strategic with what you bold, what you underline, what you italicize, and what you bullet point, right? And that's the information, or that's what I share with my team as well too. If there is if someone's going to get this email and these are the only things that you want them to read, like they're going to focus on these 4 things. But what are your thoughts on like kind of the formatting of emails if you do exceed those like 80 words?
It's a great question. I mean, again, if you think about web design and how
Mm-hmm.
much time and effort we would put into UX design, your user journey, where are they going to look at on that web page, guiding them towards that button that says, buy now, read more, whatever that might be, and not bombarding them with too many calls to action
Yeah.
in one web page. And it's exactly the same for emails. To your point, you have to be strategic about what you want people to do. And the the balance here is with your calls to action. So
Okay.
trying to give people information, but essentially if you're asking them to do too many things, it doesn't matter how much, how pretty it is, really.
Yeah.
Generally people will only do 1, 2, 3 things maximum, I would say, per email, because they just get a bit tired after that. We all get
Yeah.
a bit tired. It's like, oh wow, I've done 3 of those things. I need a coffee now. Yeah, that's a lot. It's a
I
lot
need
to
a
ask
break.
people to do.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm surprised with even 3 calls to action in one. But I guess, like, if you think about, well, what do you mean by
Yeah.
call to action? Because I am interpreting this as I have to actually do something. I have to respond by a certain date and like do these things outside of it. But
Yes.
are we defining
So
it in the same way?
yeah, what is the one step that you want to make that person to do next? So generally, rule of thumb, one thing per email. One thing, one email. But I understand there are circumstances where you might want them to do more than one thing, but they have to be on a connected topic.
Yeah,
So it
yeah, yeah.
has to be, a logical progression. And that's when I would say a maximum of 3. So for example, I need you to send me I guess for this podcast, send me 1, your photo, 1, your bio, and 1, your company logo.
That's what I did.
Exactly. It's exactly what you did, and I'm like, okay, I can bunch these things together. That makes sense for me as the recipient, not,
Yeah.
just for you as the sender. So absolutely, we need to think about how our emails look. I always make the comparison with like Michelin starred chefs across the world. They understand that when we look at our food, we judge it with our eyes. It's like, does that
Yeah.
look appetizing? Is that something that I want to, take a bite of? That's why they spend all that time with like tweezers, don't they? And sort of putting all the micro herbs on the top and making it look so beautiful. But it's the same with our emails. We'll get it up and we judge it instantly. And it is like, is this something I can do now? Or is this going to the save for
Mm.
later, aka email graveyard? And ideally, we want them to get into that first zone. So lots of white space, super important.
Oh, I love that.
A decent sized font. As I get older, my eyes are really failing me. My client was taking them, the mickey out of me the other day because I was like, I can't see what you've written. But, think about your demographic, over the
Yeah.
age of 45, our eyes start to, really go downhill. We're reading stuff on mobile, on our cell phones all the time. If your font
Yeah.
is too small, it looks horrible. Short paragraphs, 2 sentences, 3 sentences, max, ideally 2. A short first sentence that just says, look, this isn't going to be hard to read. It eases people in
Yeah. This
gently.
is what's inside.
Exactly. This isn't going to be war and peace. You can just ease your way in really gently here. So yes, putting as much thought into how it looks as to what's inside it is incredibly important.
Okay. Now we've talked about the guts of the email. We have to talk about the subject line because no one's going to get to the guts if they don't click to open the email. And the subject line is so, like, I probably will obsess over a subject line more, especially if I really need them to do that call to action. I need them to do the RSVP, right? Like,
Yep.
I've sent this one email out. Oh, please stand out. So, what do? I tend to want to save this, read this, your call to action here in the subject line. But what are some tips to, especially in that business email, to get people to open the email, to read it, to know that it's not just an automatic email or it hasn't been sent in some sequence that you somehow got signed up for?
Yeah, it's a great one, a great question, and I think there's a real sense of desperation out there. Like, you
There
know,
is.
how do we make sure that our email is the one that gets read and opened? And it's not just with marketing emails; it is with our everyday
Yeah.
emails, and it's really exhausting that we're sort of constantly having to work extra hard, as you say. You know, RSVP, just please give me what I want.
Just open it.
Oh, there was one of the participants on a masterclass that I was doing recently, and she said, "I just put read me in all of my subject lines. Is that wrong?" And I was like, "Oh my god!" It's like
The stress.
it's like the sort of smell of the whiff of desperation there. But you know, there are some better ways. And actually, in my book, I didn't talk about my book, Email Attraction. There's a whole chapter in here about subject lines and really trying to think a bit more creatively about how you approach them. And the first thing that I always advise people starting with is, what's the emotion that you want people to feel, rather than what is it that you're trying to get out of them, or what do you want them to know. So it might be, for example, you want them to feel reassured, like you've got this.
Yeah.
Or you might want them to feel curious, or maybe a little bit of, you know, FOMO, a bit of fear of missing out,
Yeah.
or a bit of anxiety. Oh my goodness, I'm going to miss the deadline. Or,
Yeah.
you know, so starting with really getting clear on that. I think sometimes we just come at it with like a sort of brainstorm 20, you know, subject lines and try and find something. But if we think
Yeah.
about what that thing is. So for example, if you're sending a cold email to someone that you haven't met before, you're trying to, I don't know, book a meeting or something, it's a sort of sales focused email, you know, what's that point of connection? What do you want them to feel? Well, you want them to maybe feel curious, or you want them to feel that you're someone worth talking to. So where can you leverage your point of connection? So it might be that, you know, I write in an email, you know, Sarah Edwards suggested that I ... And if Sarah Edwards is our point of connection, you know, so you're
Yeah.
using a little bit, okay, here's the person that we have in common, but then there's the ... the ellipsis there that you're creating a bit of curiosity.
And now I want to know what Sarah said.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think it's a very fine line between that and annoying clickbait. And I think we can really quickly turn people off. I mean, I'm sure you received them. I get
Oh,
so
all the time.
many awful sales emails, you know, that are just like, "Hey, Kim," you know, or the subject line is completely misleading, you know, where I think that this is a client, I think this is someone that I've spoken to before, and I find out that it isn't. And that, I think, is misleading. That doesn't build trust.
Yeah.
So it's finding that fine line, and often that means just spending a bit more time really thinking about how you want them to feel, and doing your research sometimes. You know, what is it about that person, if it's someone that you don't know very well, if that's a customer, or it might be just, you know, playing with a few ideas. I think it's Marie Forleo, I heard her say that they do 26 subject lines for examples for every email that they send out. I mean, that's, you know, that's a lot, but they
That's
really
excessive.
go through that process. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that for every email that you send, you know, just from your inbox. But I think it's experimenting. You know, if you want a meeting with someone, don't just put meeting request. You know, you need to work a bit harder than that. If you're sending an update, don't just put update. What is it? What's the one thing that that person might be really interested in? You know,
Yeah.
great news. You know, Project X has moved, you know, developments on Project X. You know, so what can we do to really keep these engaging? We've got to pull it out of the hat a bit more. We've got to work a bit harder at those subject lines.
I am loving all of this advice. Well, because I think that they're really actionable and things that you can easily implement that will make a difference in the communication. I have one last question about just kind of subject line, and I'm sure you get this all the time. What's my subject line length? Because I've gone back and forth. I've talked to a lot of people about it. Some people are like, keep it short. It can't be longer. And then I've talked to other people who are like, make it as long as it needs to be. Maybe that's what, makes it stand out in the inbox. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it does depend on your audience. I mean, a lot of if you're emailing corporates, for example, they often have a lot of firewalls, and they'll have half of your subject line will be like, warning, external email.
Yes.
And then you'll only have they'll only see like 8 characters of your subject line. So it does depend on who you're emailing. Generally, and this is a rule of thumb across everything, I think being interesting beats any rule. And in fact, anything that I've even said, even an 80-word email, if you're really, and this applies to marketing, long copy versus short copy, if you are interesting, people will read it. Yeah. And so for me, that trumps everything. That all said, I think you need to get, if you do have a longer subject line, you need to get the value in those first few little words.
Yeah.
So I'm sending out my gift guide. I do that every year. I have my own email newsletter. And I make sure that the word weird is in my first 3 words because I know that that's a real trigger word. Like my crazy thousands of people who've signed up for my weird emails every week, that's what they love. It's unconventional stuff. They know that they're going to get something a bit different from me. So it's that word that then they associate with my brand. So get the value in early, even if your subject line is longer.
Great advice. Now, my final question, which is the prediction question, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. What do you see kind of changing, evolving with email communication over like the next year?
It's a really great question. I think it's going to bump up the priority for lots of organizations. I think, applying some of this rigor that they see, that they apply to marketing. I definitely see organizations really waking up to this now. I predict ongoing mayhem with Slack and other platforms versus email. I think there's, and I think it will probably take another year of pain for organizations to really sort of handle this, but really understanding how do you use email versus how you use Slack. Some people are really great at this, but understanding, it's not, in my world, it's not either or. I think there's a place for both of them if that's how you choose to work. But really understanding where is the value of each? How do we as an organization approach both of those? And I definitely see an increased move to more informal language. So a lot of the stuff that we, that sort of more informal approach that we see on messaging platforms, I think that is coming much more into email. I mean, even 2 years ago or sort of pre-pandemic, emojis and emails were really quite rare. And now you do see them all the time. I mean, a few years ago, I wouldn't have dreamt of putting an emoji in an email. I really wouldn't have done. But I do use them quite a lot now. So I think this informality, this more relaxed approach, that reflects essentially how we're all working now. So that's probably I've given you three predictions. There we go.
Well, I only asked for one, so 3 was the delight, and I love that. And I think that it is. I also really love that you describe Slack, the Slack mayhem, because it is very true. I think we all went to working remote, and there are multiple ways, and there's a channel for everything, and then there's the I'm sure that you've had this conversation. I sent you the email, or you're in a meeting and they're like, I'll send it to you. And you're like, where are you sending it? Is it in chat? Is it in Slack? Did you email it to me? Did you email it directly or just share it? There's so many, like, I live in this digital cloud of like, could you just send it in the chat again? Please?
Yeah. Can you just put it in the mail for me, please? And then we all know where we're at, you know?
Exactly. I don't check that thing for a month.
Yeah.
So, well, this has been an absolute delight. I have learned so much. Thank you so much for coming on here and just kind of sharing your wisdom.
Oh, it's been a total pleasure. I've loved it.